Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and in this episode we'll be talking to Professor Eric Long, a biology professor who has learned to live in the space between science and theology. In our conversation about wildlife ecology and ecotheology, we consider the important truth that everyone, no matter what their vocation, can and should choose to be an ecologist, or theologian for that matter.
But if we can have these conversations with folks who have background in economics and sociology and theology and political science, my goodness, I mean, these problems that we're facing in the world are the solution is not solely more science. I mean, we've got to enact these solutions, and we need a lot of voices at the table to do that.
Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Well, welcome again, everybody. We have a very interesting episode today, as usual. And what makes it particularly interesting is that I have my sometime co-host with me, James Amidon, who is the executive director of Circlewood and a good friend. How you doing, James?
I'm doing great and really looking forward to this conversation.
We also have with us Dr. Eric Long. Eric, why don't you just situate yourself with the listeners and talk a bit about what you do?
I'm a professor of biology at Seattle Pacific University, where I've been working for about 15 years. I'm a wildlife ecologist, so my interests, my passions, my research primarily focus on large mammals. I've done some work with cougars in the past, worked with black bears. My PhD program at Penn State was working with white-tailed deer back in Pennsylvania. And now that I'm in the Pacific Northwest, I've been working primarily with black-tailed deer out here on the West Coast. Most of my work is in the San Juan Islands with the black-tailed deer population out there.
So you are clearly really invested both in the scientific approach to understanding nature and the environment, but also committed to themes of creation care in your work. And I'm wondering, how did you get where you are? What are some of the things that led you to be doing what you do?
I was blessed, I think, to grow up in a very rural part of Pennsylvania. And so I was surrounded by woods from an early age, and it was really easy for me to get outside and get dirty in nature. And from early on, I realized that was kind of my happy place. This is where I wanted to be. I loved to be outside. I loved whenever I spotted an animal, that was the highlight. I loved to just sit and watch and see what the animal was doing, observe its behavior. I was that kid that was always bringing bugs back to the house to put in a jar, put in a terrarium, and then to watch them and see what they were doing, to feed them and see if I could figure out what it was that they liked to eat. And so this really started from a young age, this passion for being outside, this passion of looking at and studying animals. And then I think it just progressed from there. It was one of those things where I realized this is something that I really, really love. And eventually I realized it was something I could make a career out of. So I just kind of followed that path.
Eric, I'm wondering if there were key people or experiences along the way that really nurtured that in you and encouraged you to keep pursuing that natural love you had from your time as a child.
My father was one of the key figures, obviously, and he had me outside a lot. Central Pennsylvania, the fishing was really good, so he took me out early outside to go fishing. But then I remember also the blossoming academic approach to this as well. I remember in fourth grade, we had this assignment. My teacher, Mrs. Frazier, gave me this assignment where we were supposed to identify 20 birds. We were supposed to see where they were and keep it in a little field notebook, see if we could figure out what species it was and where we saw it and when we saw it. Again, the assignment was 20 observations. I came back when the assignment was due with over 200. I was in, man. I was hooked. It was a blast. And I remember as part of it, I mean, she didn't require this, but because of this, the first book that I ever bought with my own money is I went to the little local bookstore and I bought a field guide to the birds that then I could carry in my little backpack or back pocket wherever I was going because I wanted to identify what was out there. So that was fourth grade. Ironically, kind of fast forward to high school, her husband, Mr. Fraser, helped me get involved with a local college that was doing some research on songbirds. They were the scientists there. I was not the scientist. I was the high school kid. And so, but they had these nets set up where they could catch little songbirds, these little delicate songbirds, and they would get tangled in the net. And my job was to go from net to carefully untangle the bird and bring it back to the researchers, who would then weigh it and, take these measurements on it and then affix a little band. It was a bird banding project, right? And then I got to hold the bird and then let the bird go and watch it fly away. My great fortune was I got to do this for 2 consecutive years. And when I came back that second year, I remember catching a bird that had a band on it, a recaptured one that I had held the previous year. And the fascinating thing is this bird was a neotropical migrant, which means between the 2 times that I was holding this bird, that little tiny bird had flown to Brazil and back. And I thought, man, the stories you can tell, right? And I saw the researchers doing this. I got to be part of it, get my hands dirty. And I thought, this is what I want to do. This is where I want to go. So, the love for the animals and watching the behavior and then realizing that it's something you can do with a career.
I love that story. When you talk about these things, there's obviously a lot of passion in your voice and a sense of wonder even, which I think is not always part of the scientific mindset. And I know that you're a researcher and you could have chosen a career in just pure research, but you've also chosen a career in teaching. And I'm wondering, what's that about? And how is it that you actually find significance in your students as well?
There might be a little bit of teaching in the blood. My dad was my high school chemistry teacher. I went biology and he's a chemist, but we still have a good relationship. So I'm thankful for that. I remember I didn't really make this decision what I wanted to do with wildlife biology until pretty far through my PhD program. I was still weighing the option of going full-time researcher with like an agency, perhaps like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or going into academia where teaching would be a big component of my job. When I was weighing these options, I was thinking back on a lot of the moments of my life or the things that really brought me joy. And I remember in college, when I'd be studying with my friends and there'd be a difficult concept. And if it was one that I happened to get, and frankly, often it was chemistry because my dad was a really good teacher. So I went into college knowing chemistry pretty well. And when I could help my friends understand a difficult concept and you could see that light bulb go off, that just brought joy. That just was a high. I got excited about that. And so throughout that, I remember like anytime that I was able to work with people and either explain something difficult in a way that made sense or get them passionate or inspired about something that they might not have thought deeply about before, there's this just deep sense of satisfaction. I see that now. I get a chance to teach a lot of students at SPU in the biology major, most of whom don't come in saying they want to be wildlife ecologists, right? I'm teaching a lot of students with a lot of different interests, many of whom don't even really know what ecology is when I'm teaching ecology and introductory biology. And when I get a chance to introduce, my subdiscipline to them and watch the light bulbs go off and the interests get sparked, I mean, it's just affirmation. I love that I get to continuously do research and work with animals. I love that I get to work with college students and share my passions.
I'm wondering if you have noticed a change in your students over the years, SPU being a faith-based institution. So your students are coming in perhaps with some church background. Maybe if you could speak to their reception of some of your teaching around evolution and ecology. Have you seen a shift over the years?
At SPU, we are a faith-based school. That said, not all of our students identify with one particular faith tradition. So we have a fantastic diversity of students coming in. Some of them coming up through the public school system have had a robust education on evolution coming in. Some of them coming up through other forms of education. It's the first time that perhaps they're encountering evolution in an academic context. I'll preface this by saying I went to a Christian undergraduate school too, and I was excited as a biologist going to this Christian school, having come through public school. I was like, oh, good, I'm going to a Christian school, and now I'm going to learn how it really happened. And there are my Christian professors who proceed to teach me about evolution. And my mind was blown. And I mean, there was no way that I could question the bona fides of these professors. I mean, they were godly men and women, and they're up there talking about how God created through evolution, and I just had never seen that modeled before. And now I get to do the same, and it's one of my favorite parts of my job is to talk to students about God as creator, and then to show them that there is not one Christian way to think about how God creates. What we can all agree upon is that God is the creator. But then to expose them to this idea of God creating through a process, evolution by natural selection and other evolutionary mechanisms, it's just one of my favorite parts of my job. And there's only so much you can do in the big lecture hall experience. But the other thing, SPU is a smaller school. So I always tell my students, I bet a lot of you have more questions on this. I sure did when I was an undergrad. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Let's grab some coffee and chat more about this. And these one-on-one conversations where we get to hash out these details, just fantastic.
I'm really, really intrigued by bringing in the theme of spirituality, of a spiritual sensibility to both the science, but I guess also just the relationship that you seem to promote when you teach your students about the environment. I'm wondering, how does that enter into your teaching or even into your conversations? This whole idea that there's a spiritual dimension to our connection to the environment around us.
This is not the vocabulary that I was equipped with coming through grad school, right? I mean, nowhere in my graduate education through state schools do we talk about the spirituality of nature. But as someone who is spiritual, as someone who believes that God creates and sustains nature, right? Everything that we see around us, I feel like it's impossible to adequately teach about the creation without talking about the spiritual aspects of it. I'm sure my scientific tools are not like when I publish my scientific papers, there's probably nothing in those papers that would show the reader that I'm a Christian, that I'm a theist, that I believe that there's this deep spiritual part about creation. But when I'm in the classroom, I mean, that it is a drum that I beat. It is something that I say, look, I love science. I went pro in science, but there are some things that science can't answer. Science can answer a lot of the how, but it can't answer the why, right? It can't answer these deeper questions. But when we bring the Christian story into this, when we bring the creation story into this, we don't just answer how creation functions, we can also answer why creation is there, why it exists, and then to get a little more personal, what is my role in it? My background in conservation biology really emphasizes the role that humans play in terms of caring for creation. But then my background as a Christian also gives me more vocabulary on that. It gives me more reasons to double down on this importance of caring for creation. So I don't think that you can extract those two from each other and tell the full story of what creation is doing and why it's doing and why we are to be doing what we're supposed to be doing with it.
It sounds like that is the kind of integration present not just in you, but also throughout SPU. Can you talk a little bit about your recent collaboration with theologians at the college to create an ecotheology minor?
This is one of the projects I'm most excited about. SPU, here we are, we're this relatively small Christian school in the Pacific Northwest we have a major in ecology, which is kind of unique for a smaller school. And then we obviously have a thriving theology department. And then there's a number of theologians or members of our faculty in the School of Theology who are passionate about creation care. Two in particular that I've worked closely with, J.J. Johnson-Lisi and Mike Langford. And the three of us just kind of got together and said, we got the tools in place that we can do this. Like, if not us, who? We could look at this ecology and look at this theology, and we're recognizing in our students this curiosity and a passion for creation care. I mean, one of the great things that I've seen change in students over time, I'm seeing these incoming students being more aware, more concerned, more passionate about creation care. And we thought this was a great place where we could, bring these passions and our backgrounds together. So last year was the first year that it went live. We have a new minor in ecotheology, and it's really intentionally interdisciplinary. The minor doesn't live in the theology department. It doesn't live in the biology department. It really is, we want to see a lot of different students who can get into this minor, who can bring their unique perspectives and background and contribute to this. Because creation care isn't owned by ecologists. Creation care isn't owned by theologians. This is really an interdisciplinary topic. That said, as an ecologist, I would argue that to do it the best that we can, we need to have some education in ecology. So there are ecology classes built into the minor. We need to have education in theology and biblical studies. So there are those classes in the minor. But there are classes like sustainable food production, right? Taught through our nutrition department. There are things like environmental economics. There are history classes to try to get us, context. There are ethics classes taught by philosophy. So I see a lot of touch points, a lot of ways to enter into this minor. It's not just for ecologists. We have a number of students from global development that are really interested in going out into the world, but recognizing to really do this, that a background in ecotheology, a background in creation care is going to be essential for the work that they do around the globe.
So I have talked to you about this before, and remember you mentioning a moment where I believe you were maybe doubting your credentials as a theologian, right? And I think you said, I'm not a theologian, to the theologians with whom you were working, and their response was that you are a theologian. And I'm curious about that conversation and what it meant for you.
I'm so blessed by my colleagues in the School of Theology. I'm expanding out from what my background was. I'm reading and thinking and even teaching a lot more in creation care and in the theology behind it. But as I mentioned before, that's not what I got in grad school, right? I learned how to do statistical analysis and a lot of math and a lot of modeling, some of this drier stuff. But now I want to teach about creation care. So I'm reading about it, but I always felt hesitant or like, oh, am I out of my lane? And so I'd talk with the School of Theology and I'd say, yeah, but I'm not a theologian. And they would stop me and they'd say, yes, you are. Right. And that was so encouraging, not because I've achieved some high level of education, not because I have letters after my name that designate formal training in theology. I think what they were saying is you're a theologian because you're curious about these questions and you're digging in. Empowered by that message, I've tried to move that forward with my students too, and say, look, if you're interested in ecology, you don't have to have letters after your name to say that you're an ecologist. I want, like, you're welcome in this ecotheology minor. You're welcome in these ecology classes. And because, are you curious about how creation works? Are you open to asking and observing answers to those questions? Then you're an ecologist, right? Now, you can go to school for a bunch of years and get some letters after your name, and that just makes it formal. But if you're asking questions about how it works, ecology is the study of the interactions that we see among all the organisms, right? And so if you're interested about how these things play together in nature, you're an ecologist. And you bringing your background and your perspective from whatever your discipline into this question, we need to hear that. And you're going to bring a voice to this discussion that if it's just us ecologists in the ivory tower talking among ourselves, we're going to miss it. So I think there's great benefit here from the interdisciplinary.
James, I'm intrigued by this point of intersection because you come from the other side of it. You studied theology at the doctoral level and did a lot of research, and yet were absolutely intrigued by all things ecology. And I'm wondering what that was like for you, your experience of playing the line between the fields, as it were.
Yes, I am, as you know, Forrest, a big proponent of integration. The more things we can bring together, the more creative understanding we come to know. And I think any discipline that you study, whether it's math, ecology, or theology, when it's isolated and by itself, you lose some of the richness of what's out there. And I think for me, starting to get a basic understanding of ecology not only helped me in the understanding of the world and how it worked, it helped me read scripture differently. It helped me understand theology deeper. It started, in many ways, it made sense of things I did not understand before, and it opened new avenues of learning. And I am really grateful for that. And if theology doesn't speak to the world as it's lived every day on this planet, then it's probably not doing its job. So I think we need to have these intersections like this creatively, formally, and we need to give people permission to go beyond what they may feel comfortable saying they know things about, and asking questions and being collaborative, all of these kind of things, because we live in a collaborative world that's so interconnected that to not do so misses the beauty and the richness and complexity of the world that God has made. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this. So I'm resonating with Eric's passion. And I guess my follow-up question is, where do you see that intersection bringing new life to your understanding of ecology and theology, new life to the way you're teaching your students?
Gosh, so many places where this comes together. I mean, let's just the example that we're talking about right now, how diversity brings greater perspective, right? Well, diversity, I got lectures on diversity. This is what ecologists talk about, right? Like when we're comparing two ecosystems and we see one that's very biodiverse and we see another that's a monoculture, a huge cornfield versus a diverse rainforest. Well, ecologists, we have the tools to go and we can do all sorts of numeric analysis of these and write, frankly, some, I think, interesting, others may find them dry papers in the scientific literature about those. But now, we've got the ecological vocabulary to talk about what diversity brings us. But now when I have folks who have been trained in other backgrounds and they're like, you know what, my background talks about diversity as well. And look at this intersection. Look about how we can talk about diversity resulting in, ecologists call them emergent properties, right? The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, these synergisms. And I know my thinking of the value of diversity has been enriched by my colleagues who might not be coming from an ecological background, speaking about what diversity means in their field. And when we bring these together, it's like, oh my goodness, right? And I can tell them, oh, this is how ecologists think about it. And they're like, oh, that's fascinating, because look at the analogy or the intersection to how we think about it. So, I mean, that's just one example of many. One of the things that's really got me interested in, kind of continuing with the ecotheology is I recognize that a lot of the literature on ecotheology has been written by theologians, and ecologists have been rather silent on this. It's fairly hard to find ecotheology stuff that's written by ecologists. Now, I don't think I have the truth or, a voice that needs to be louder than any other, but I think ecologists have some unique insights that can contribute to this discussion, and we can feed off each other that way.
In our conversation with Eric Long, we're being reminded that anyone can find ways to work for the good of the earth, no matter what their vocation. You don't need a degree in environmental science to understand ecology, or a theology degree to see the ways that God is revealed in nature. Eric's message resonates with the mission of Earthkeepers. We aim to encourage and equip people to think way out of the box when it comes to figuring out how their jobs, their hobbies, even their community and family lives can all be directed toward promoting the health of the planet. Earthkeepers believe in greening everything. What about you? Have you discovered a creative way to integrate ecological action into your life? An idea or practice that might inspire other Earthkeepers to try something new? We would love to hear from you. Go to the Earthkeepers website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers and use the recording link to leave a quick voicemail. You might just hear us share your message with the community on future episodes. Again, that's www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers, or just look for the link in the podcast show notes. Well, I'll tell you what interests me in particular about this conversation between the two of you, and that has a lot to do with maybe the democratization of both of these fields. Because as we know, oftentimes what constitutes a field is the boundaries that are put up around it. What it takes to be an ecologist or what it takes to be a theologian is oftentimes pretty restrictive and even exclusive. And so you don't often see this sort of integrative thinking, this kind of conversation that generates new ideas. But I think also there is something here that really hits me on a personal level because Eric, I like you was really, really into nature and animals, etc. as a kid. And I know it's not very creative, but in sixth grade, my nickname was Terrarium Guy because the teacher had put me in charge of 3 terrariums that I had built in the back.
Can we resurrect that? Can we start calling you Terrarium
Yeah.
Guy?
No. Well, if it was catchier, maybe, but come on, Terrarium Guy. So anyway, that stuck with me for better or for worse for a good while. But I guess my point is that eventually, even though my love for nature didn't die, I didn't find a way forward into pursuing it as a vocation. I ended up in college as an English major and with a minor in anthropology. And at that point, I thought, well, if I don't go back and figure this out, I'm probably not going to have another chance at it. And so I went to school to get a forestry degree. And that did not work out because the first classes they had me take were all kind of hard science courses. And I just didn't have the aptitude for that. I mean, I had the love for nature and I loved understanding all things about ecology, but chemistry was not doing it for me, and
Yeah.
physics killed me.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only class I passed actually that quarter was physiology because it was a little bit closer to life than
Mhm.
than the other 2 fields. And
Mhm.
so, it left me sad that quarter. And eventually, I pursued other passions, especially in terms of community development, social justice, and I live a very happy life pursuing those things. But I do think that a lot of people get stopped in the same way, and there are many people who would love to devote their lives to creation care, to advocacy for the environment, for environmental justice, and often don't see a way forward.
Mhm.
And what you two are talking about somehow suggests to me that there are probably more ways than we know. And maybe it's different today even, that there are more ways opening up and that maybe the boundaries are not so hard and fast. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. And I think this was when we were, again, working on developing this minor in ecotheology. I had this aha moment. I was looking at these classes that I teach. So I teach an upper division class in ecology. I teach an upper division class in conservation biology. I teach an upper division class in forest ecology. Every one of those classes has as prerequisites a year of chemistry and a year of introductory biology and a course in statistics. So you want to dig in on conservation biology, you got 2 years of coursework before you can even touch this stuff. And we did not have an offering. We didn't have these like kind of gateway classes to students who have an interest in this, but may not want to do a year of chemistry to get there. If your ultimate career goal was to be a research wildlife biologist, you need those courses. You need statistics, right? You need to be able to do some math, but that's not the only way to engage in this creation care. And we shouldn't exclude that type of educational addition to folks that don't frankly need a year of chemistry and a year of introductory biology to get there. So we really looked through our curriculum and said, is there a way that we can, offer some classes? Can we have some classes for students that really want to learn some of the science behind it, even if they're not necessarily going to go pro in science? And I think we've been able to do that. And we've got, hey, we can teach you some really important things about conservation biology without necessarily having to do 2 years of prerequisites to get there. And then everybody wins on this because I was missing out on those perspectives from my students who are coming from other backgrounds, right? Again, there's that synergy. If I'm only teaching scientists, then we're siloed. But if we can have these conversations with folks who have background in economics and sociology and theology and political science, my goodness, I mean, these problems that we're facing in the world are the solution is not solely more science. I mean, we've got to enact these solutions, and we need a lot of voices at the table to do that.
Yeah, I want to echo that and just democratize it just even more. If you open the Bible and read it and think about it, you're a theologian. If you're looking at
Mm-hmm.
what's happening in your backyard or your neighborhood, you are doing the work of ecology. When Jesus says, consider the lilies, look at the birds, when you do that, you're doing the work of ecology. And there are lots of ways to participate in this without advanced degrees, without all of these courses. There are citizen scientists all across the world doing valuable research for people. And of course, as someone who was a pastor, often the best theologians were those in the pews, not necessarily me when I was preaching. So I just want to encourage all of our listeners today that if you can get some education around these issues, that's great. If that's not available to you, you are still part of the community.
Completely agree. That you mentioned citizen science, and I think this is one of the great changes and one of the great advances that science has made recently. I mean, we are so taking advantage of the connectivity that people have. Before, science was done by the scientists out in the field, and now there's so much good scientific work being done by just connecting thousands of observers who know their backyard, who know their little plot of woods, and they can feed into this big, kind of collaborative data set. And we are learning so much more. And that is by outsourcing the work of ecology to 1,000 ecologists spread over the globe.
I really love this word democratization then as a theme in some ways here, because one of the maybe emerging missions of this podcast is this idea that, as James put it to me a few days ago, this idea of greening everything, right? We cannot silo the work of caring for the earth just to sort of a few select fields or professions. That greening really should impact every career. The other day, we spoke to a guy who works for land management for the government, and he talked about, again, the same question is, do you have to be a scientist to do good work? And he pointed to his interest in music. He does music festivals, and so he used the festival as this example of all the different fields that could be touched by this sort of green mentality, this social environmental justice mentality, and talked about, even the food vendors making a difference in terms of how they serve their food and how they recycle their products and how they source their food. And I really think that sensibility is something that this podcast is hoping to promote, so that we'll talk to teachers, we'll talk to ranchers, we can talk to plumbers, we can talk to insurance agents and real estate agents. And somehow there's got to be a way forward for everyone to be part of this work. I mean, if we're going to actually save the world from a destructive trajectory, we all have to be involved in these ways.
I completely agree with that. And I think, one of the themes that I try to work with my students on is I set up this false dichotomy. I say, well, which is more important, social justice or environmental justice? And it's a bad question, right? That you can't do one without the other. These are two sides of the same coin. If you care about justice, then you care about social justice and you care about environmental justice. We cannot isolate those two things. You cannot care for the poor if you're also not caring for the environment. And so we have to consider these as a whole.
So I actually teach community development, and we have, of course, a strong theme of social justice built into the program. In fact, it really is one of the prime motivators of people in the field. But you would be surprised at how surprised people are at that idea that we actually can't separate the two, social justice and environmental justice. And yet people in the field do, because, I mean, to their credit, they care about people. And so they prioritize human flourishing. But I think what's missing is this idea that human flourishing is not isolatable. Human flourishing is global flourishing, it's environmental flourishing. And so, as you put it, you can't have one without the other. So in my programs in my teaching, we actually have elements of environmental justice and creation care built in for that very reason. But it's not always the norm. It's not the first way of thinking about that relationship to people and the world.
Eric, one thing that Forrest and I have observed over the last few years in the generations that are growing up on a planet in crisis is that they kind of have this sense that we're talking about more intuitively than perhaps we did growing up. And I'm wondering if you are seeing that in your students as the years progress, because I can imagine what we just talked about for some, particularly for some Christians perhaps raised in more conservative traditions, that might be something they've never heard of before, or it might feel threatening. Do you see that in your students, and have you seen a shift?
Yeah, this is one of the real encouraging things that I've seen. And I guess I'm getting old now that I have these like time series that I can, I've been teaching for 15 years and I'm starting to see the students change. So, when I started, I was kind of like the cool older brother and now I'm dad. But I am encouraged to see that the students are coming much. I don't have to sell to them. I don't have to convince them that climate change is real and that climate change is human caused. I don't need to do that near as much as I did early on. And that's encouraging to see that I think this message of scientists, right, is getting out there and it's taking hold. But I also know like it's coming. I'm not exactly sure where it's coming because, and I think it's coming through the schools, but still not necessarily through a lot of the churches. If I ask my students, how many of you who go to church regularly have heard a sermon, have heard a Sunday morning devoted to creation care? And that's still the minority, right? It's still not necessarily coming from the pulpit. And it's not that the church is leading the charge on this, which that's discouraging to me. I feel like with a good understanding what God is calling us to do, we should be the ones leading this charge.
Yeah, we've had guests on the podcast who point to a change, a shift that's happening that may in fact end up leaving some people behind a little bit. People for whom that leap of understanding is maybe just a little too great. But they find their hope in the fact that there are some people who are really living out a different way of thinking about our relationship to the earth, living it out in new and kind of radical ways so just a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, I see a lot of signs of encouragement here.
I am really curious about the research that you're doing to shift away from the work you do as a professor and talk a little bit more about what you do on Blakely Island with the black-tailed deer.
My background, I mentioned, I primarily work with large mammals. That's kind of been the way that after starting with the little songbirds, I guess I moved up the food chain a little bit. Currently, I'm working with black-tailed deer out on the San Juan Islands. The island that I focus primarily on is Blakely Island because that's where Seattle Pacific has its field station, so I can live there and work there. For folks that are familiar with the San Juan, it's a group, an archipelago of islands just off the northwest coast here of Washington in the Puget Sound. But the islands generally aren't really large, and most of the islands are large enough to have deer populations, but what we don't see on them is predators. So here we see an example ecologically of what happens when we potentially get an ecosystem out of balance. So it's an indirect way to kind of look at the role of predators. We look at a system where there aren't predators. And if there is a theme that has gone through my work, I've really been interested in what role predators play. And I had research back in Pennsylvania where I did my PhD. Historically, Pennsylvania had cougars and wolves. Those have been hunted to extinction in most of the eastern US. And so we see the deer without natural predators. Now I'm out in the San Juans where, because of the small islands and to a lesser extent hunting, we don't see predators in the San Juans. So we see very large deer populations and ironically, a very small deer. The body size of deer on the islands are smaller than normal. And then we see these knock-on effects when the predators aren't in that system and when the deer populations can grow to very high numbers, then we see the forest responding in some worrisome ways. It's extremely difficult to grow particular trees out in the San Juans. We see a wonderful canopy of this old growth Douglas fir, but with a large deer population. I challenge my students to get down on their hands and knees and tell me if they can find a Douglas fir sapling, because as soon as that thing pokes up through the ground, the deer are eating it. So we see the forest changing. It's not that nothing can grow, but the things that can grow now on the islands are the things that deer can't eat. Some of those are non-native species. Foxglove is beautiful. If anybody has foxgloves in their flower garden, they are just beautiful plants, but they're not supposed to be in the woods. And foxgloves have escaped. They are thriving out on the islands because deer can't eat them, because foxgloves are highly toxic. They have a chemical in them called digitalin that will stop your heart and a deer's heart too, as it turns out. So it's interesting to see what can and can't grow. And when you remove predators, to think about all the knock-on effects to an ecosystem, when you just remove one element of an ordered system, how it changes.
So what this suggests to me then is that if you can look at a system and see its broken elements, its deficiencies, well, that suggests too that there might be answers to bringing it back into balance. And then that raises the question of, well, who's going to do that? I know a lot of environmentalists who are purists in a way, and their answer to earth care is stay out of the way, do nothing, walk backwards, and turn away from creation and let it thrive. And yet that clearly is not working on the islands, right? So what is the role of people in this equation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I'll reference that first paper that I use in my conservation biology class. And in that paper, it's titled, What is Conservation Biology? By Michael Soule, who's kind of one of the founders of the field. It was written decades ago. But it makes the analogy in conservation biology between conservation biology and cancer biology. Okay, so ecology is learning the principles of how it works. And then conservation is applying those principles with some values associated. Just like, for instance, cellular biology is learning how the cells work, but then cancer biology is we're going to go in and we need to have some decision rules and we need to have some values. A healthy cancer-free person is better than a person that doesn't have the cancer. And so conservation biology has this applied focus on it. And so it is a very active field. And the reality is, with as much as we have like the very large footprint that humanity has put on the globe, to say that if we just step back and don't touch it, everything will be all right. Well, we have made changes to the earth that would certainly impede the ability of creation to heal itself in any sort of reasonable time frame. Also, I think it's important to remember that, like, although creation is not about us, we are allowed to use aspects of creation. I mean, I had a friend in grad school once say we should never cut down another tree. And I said, well, what are you going to build your house out of, right? So the idea here is that how do we balance the needs of people, and there are needs of people, while also trying to allow creation to thrive. And to do that, I think we need to know the ecology. We need to know how these systems interact. We need to be able to identify what the problems are. But in this high-touch system that we're living in, it's not enough simply to step back. We may need to go in and do some things. One example, I think forest fires are on a lot of people's minds right now. And we have had sometimes in the past too high of a touch on this. In the past, we saw a forest fire that would start to burn. And as soon as it started to burn, we just put it out as quick as we could put it out, right? And now, because of that, we have seen the layer of debris on the ground has built up more than what it should have. Forest fire is a natural cyclical process. And when you have frequent low-intensity forest fires, the forest can be very healthy. But if we put out the forest fire all the time, then you can build up this debris. And then when the spark hits that you can't stop, it's going to burn more intense than it would have otherwise. So now maybe the pendulum swings and we're like, we let every fire just burn, right? Because forest fire is good. Let's not stop any fire. We can't do that. That would not be the right move now, to just let every fire burn, be like, I'm sorry, your town is in the way of the fire. We're just going to let it burn. That would not be just. So we're trying to find this balance between, like, do we need to step in at every instance and try to, exert our will on it? But stepping back completely isn't the right answer either. And we need to find, and these are tough issues. And again, this is where ecologists don't have the only answer. We need city planners to step into this. We need folks with many different backgrounds to help answer these applied questions.
Yeah, Eric, just as a follow-up to that, I think it's been interesting to see people think about these issues in light of the coronavirus and the changes in the way we're living at the moment, all the way from what happens when we do step back and can't go about our daily lives and can't drive our cars and fly our airplanes. Look at what happens just over the course of a couple of weeks. We see some dramatic changes when humanity does pull back our consumptive patterns. And on the other hand, you're hearing more and more cities and even whole countries saying, as we emerge from this, can we emerge greener? Can we think about this as an opportunity to inhabit our space differently? And that to me is pretty encouraging.
Absolutely. I think one of the silver linings to this crazy 2020 that we're living in, right? As we see these stories coming through about the resilience of nature, we see in some ways how quickly nature can bounce back when we step back. One of the other things that I love about this is again, we talk, citizen science, the observations that people are making when they have stepped back a little bit from the rat race. And it wasn't necessarily, their desire to step back, but this is imposed on them. And they're seeing birds in their backyard that they have never seen before. And a lot of folks are asking, are these new? And they're like, no, they've been there, but we haven't had time or the ability to look. So I'm hopeful that there is a greater appreciation for our environment surrounding us, even the urban landscape, even the patches of green that we have here, the appreciation for that tree that you just didn't have time to sit and look at and notice that it's the home to maybe a dozen birds, right? But then also the ability to see how nature has really, in many places, thrived as we've stepped back, a chance to catch our breath, a chance to maybe hit the reset button in some ways. And when we do relaunch, to do it with these as priorities on our mind, is how can we do this in a way that values the creation in the way that it should be valued.
One question we ask most of our guests on the podcast has to do with both despair and hope. And so I'm wondering, when you think about where we are, where we're going, what causes you to despair? And then correspondingly, what gives you hope?
My mother, Ashley, actually asked me, she says, so you study all these environmental crises. Are you just depressed? And I said, fair question, because there are a number of things that are not encouraging. I'll probably use the same example for both the discouragement and the hope. Climate change discourages me. This is a very large problem that is going to require a lot of collaborative effort to work towards. And I am discouraged that I feel as if the United States is not leading the charge on this. And not only are we not leading the charge, we're not even in the middle of the pack on this. I'm discouraged that with the passion that I think many of our people have, with the scientific tools and the engineering potential that we have at our disposal, that we're not throwing whatever we got at this problem. Humans, I think, are really good at responding to crises that are in their face. They're really bad at responding to crises that seem to be off in the distance. So I get discouraged by that. But even with that theme, what I see encouraged as a college professor is this next generation of students coming up. Man, they are in. And I think, the older generation, I think we bear some of this blame, and they are ready. They're like, turn it over to us, man. We're in. We care about this, and we are going for it. Get out of our way. So I get encouraged by the young people coming up who have expressed a priority and a passion and a willingness to tackle these tough issues.
We've been in conversation with Professor Eric Long, wildlife ecologist and co-creator of the ecotheology program at Seattle Pacific University. For more information about his work, please go to the show notes for this episode. When you go to the Earthkeepers website, check out our new voice messaging option. We would love to hear your creation care success stories, or maybe your ideas for future podcast guests. In fact, we'd love to hear from you even if you just have a question you want to ask. You'll find the link to do that on the Earthkeepers website or in the show notes for this episode. Of course, you can also send us an email at podcast@circlewood.online. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. It also helps us immensely when you leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. I'm Forrest Tinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.